Hello, this is a video about JSON, J-S-O-N. And what is JSON? JSON is a data format, essentially. It's a way that we can write plain text files that describe structured data that we want to use in our program. And so basically what it amounts to is that we can either have a file in our project that represents the data that we're going to use in that project, or we can also obtain data online through APIs. And we're going to look at both of those approaches to obtaining data in this JSON format. The key win and the reason that we want to have this idea of data that's kind of separate from our program so that we're not declaring an array full of stuff at the top of our program, for example, is that it's sort of a nice way to code is to keep data separate from the stuff that acts on the data in terms of its representation. So we're going to see how it's useful over the course of this discussion of JSON. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to talk about the actual format that JSON looks like. So it's just plain text, so we'll be able to read it. And the basic idea, is that JSON looks something like this. So JSON is some text, as you can see here in my atom, and it's just in a file. The file has the extension JSON, JSON. So currently we're looking at a file here called archetypes.json, right? And a JSON file like this can have two basic overall formats. One of which is that it can be an object, a JSON object, and we can identify the fact that this is an object by the curly brackets that's around all of the data, right? There's one at the beginning here, and there is one at the end here. And then inside it is all of the data that we're going to have inside of this file. This data, by the way, is being brought in from Darius Kazemi's Corpora project. We'll be looking at that as well over the course of this discussion. So a good thing about JSON, and the reason that it's called JSON, is that it matches with how JavaScript describes data as well. In particular, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So it's about using the JavaScript way of writing an object, as we see here, to define a bunch of data that we're going to use in a program. And you can see, just by looking at it, that this description of this data, which is of archetypes from literature, very much follows the way that we're used to seeing object literals represented in JavaScript. The whole thing is inside curly brackets, and then we have a series of property names. So hero is a property name, anti-hero is a property name, and fool is a property name. Then there's a colon, and then inside each one of these things is a JavaScript value, right? So this time, each one of these has an object inside of it in these curly brackets. And so hero has an object inside it, for example, that contains further property names, so synonyms, qualities, and nature, and each of those has something else inside of them. So synonyms has got an array inside it with a single string that says protagonist, so that's a synonym for hero. Qualities has an array inside it with strings that describe the qualities of a hero, brave, willing, and determined. And nature has a single string inside it, not an array, that describes the nature of a hero, which is good. And we can see that an anti-hero is neutral and that a fool is evil, which surprises me. I think that's a little harsh. So it's the same format that we're used to already. It's just a JavaScript object that contains properties with values inside it, and some of those values are going to be more JavaScript objects or arrays or strings or numbers or booleans, etc. So you can store data just like we do in JavaScript. There's just a couple of observations that make this distinct from how we tend to see this in JavaScript. One of which is that you can see that the property names in every object have quotation marks around them, double quote marks, right? Around hero, around synonyms, nature, anti-hero, etc. They have to be there. You cannot have a JSON object without those. So remember that. And the other thing that's kind of worth remembering is that after the final element in a list, So for example, here, this is the full here is the final thing inside this object. You cannot put a comma here. In regular JavaScript, you can put a comma there, but in JSON, you cannot. So no commas at the ends of lists. This is true of arrays as well, right? We've got thoughtless, silly, and amusing. I can't put a comma there after the end of that list. Those are the only two rules that we really need to remember, okay? Quotation marks around the property names of objects and no commas at the ends of lists. Apart from that, it is the same thing that we see in JavaScript. Okay, just for completeness, the other way that we can write a JSON file, instead of writing it as one big object containing all of the information, is that we can also write it as an array containing information. And again, the notation is the same as JavaScript. We have square brackets that contain everything inside of the file, and then we have whatever we want inside that array, inside those square brackets. Here I've got a list of 4 Muppets, right? So this is muppets.json. Again, separated by commas, but no comma after that final element. That's the only rule that we need to remember there. Same as previously. So JSON, overall, a JSON file can either contain an object with the data in it or an array with the data in it. They're both fairly common. If I were leaning towards one, I would lean towards using the object format over the array format. You can always put an array inside your object if you want a list of things, but I think it's sort of healthier and more polite to do these things as objects. Okay, so we've seen a couple of JSON files. Let's go and look at a slightly more complicated JSON file. And to do that, I'm going to go across to my browser, and I'm going to go look at Darius Kazemi's Corpora project. That's at this address here, github.com/DariusK/Corpora. I'll provide links to this, of course. And what this is it's a GitHub repository that contains a whole lot of JSON files. And that's super useful because we're going to be able to use the data in here to do things that we want to do. All of the files are inside this data folder. So I'm going to click through to there. And you can see there's a whole bunch of categories. I'm going to go to the mythology category here, another folder. And I'm going to the Egyptian gods.json file here. Okay. And I want us to look at this just because it's a more complicated, maybe I shouldn't zoom in quite so close, a more complicated JSON file, right? So this is egyptiangods.json that we can see just up here. And you can see by the fact that there's this curly bracket at the beginning that it's an object. So it's a JSON file that contains an object. And then within that object, we've got 2 properties. One is the description property that contains a string describing what is in this JSON file. That's a really nice practice that makes this file more accessible to people who are using it. And the second property is the Egyptian gods property. And you can see, because the first thing that we see after the colon is a curly bracket, that this contains a list of properties with values. And we can see that the property names, pretty quickly, if we look at a few of them, are the names of the Egyptian gods. So it's an object where each property inside the object is the name of an Egyptian god. There's lots of them. They had a lot of gods, those people. There's Imhotep, kind of my favorite name. Imhotep. And then within each of these properties, and let's go back up to the top and just look at Ani. Within each property that's the name of an Egyptian god, we can see, looking at the notation here again, it starts with a curly bracket, so it's another object. And inside this object is the information about that Egyptian god divided into properties again. So there's a depictions property that contains what kinds of depictions of this god there are. That we can see contains an array because we've got square brackets around it. And that has one or more strings inside it, or maybe no strings, telling you what this god might look like when it is depicted. Ani is depicted as an ape and nothing else. We also get a genders property. I enjoy that this is plural. That's because some Egyptian gods have multiple genders. And that contains another array that contains the possible genders. Ani is male. Then we have a keywords property of Ani, and that gives us some keywords around like what kinds of things this god might represent. And here we have an array as well, and this has 2 things, an ape and protection. So Ani is an ape god associated with protection and is male. So that's what the data is telling us, right? So there is all kinds of information packed into this. both in terms of quantity, right? There's like lots and lots and lots of gods here that we can play around with, so to speak, while being very respectful. And there's sort of a lot of quality information here being represented with an object for each god that contains depictions, genders, and keywords. And we can do stuff with this data, right? So the key thing about this is we need to be able to look at this and read it, right? We need to be able to look at all of the little bits of notation, which after all are the same as JavaScript, and see how particularly we would get to particular kinds of information. So if, for example, we were wanting to get to the genders of the god, let's say Ati, the second god here, we know that we would have the main object here. So that's where we would always start when we're accessing information. Then we know we would need to access the Egyptian gods property, because that's the property that contains all of the gods. Within the Egyptian gods property, we've got an object, and we would need to go to the Ati property, the name of the god. And then within the Ati property, we know that there's another object, and that one of the properties is the genders property. So we would need to go in there, and that would give us the array of genders for Ati, right? So we would go main object, Egyptian gods, Ati, genders, and then we would have our array of genders. So we need to remember this because we need to be able to find our way through this data when we want to use things in it, right? Okay. This is a fairly complicated file already, but let's look at another, I think, very fun JSON file, which is in the divination category here. And is the tarot interpretations JSON file. So this contains, as we will see, a representation of a tarot deck. So this has more stuff going on in it, right, than we saw in the previous one, just so that we can get a sense of something a bit more complicated. Again, first we see a curly bracket. That means the whole thing is contained inside of an object. Again, it has a description property to tell you what the file is and maybe where it comes from in this case. And then it has a tarot interpretations property, and we can see here immediately after the colon, which is telling us what's inside this property, we see a square bracket, and that means it contains an array in this case. And what does it contain an array of? Let me zoom out a level here, because there's quite a lot of information here. It contains a list of objects. So here, to select the entire object, I have to go quite far. There's a lot of data for each of these things. So there's the array, and then here is the first object in that array, right? All of the stuff that I've highlighted, and then there's a comma, and then we have the next object in the array. Each of these objects represents a single card in the tarot. That's not necessarily easy to tell right away because of the order of the properties. So we can see here, fortune telling is the first property of the object, keywords is the second. If we go down to the bottom though, we can see that there's a property name that contains the name of this card, the fool. So if you have some familiarity with the tarot, it might be at that point you realize that this whole object is representing the fool card. So we know its name, its rank is 0, and its suit is major because it's from the major arcana. And then we have all of this other cool information that we can use about that card. Its fortune-telling properties. We have an array inside that property of different potential fortunes that could arise if you are dealt that card. Watch for new projects and new beginnings, for example. We have a keywords property that contains some keywords associated with the fool: freedom, faith, and experience, and innocence. And then we have a meanings property which contains both kind of positive or light meanings. So the meanings has a light property, and that contains an array of light kinds of properties about the fool, and shadow properties. Often this is when you're dealt the card and it's inverted, it's upside down. These are sort of negative associations with the fool, being silly or distracted, lacking experience as a bad thing. Okay, so there's a lot of information in here. Again, we need to be able to think in terms of how do I get to a specific piece of information in here. So if, for example, I want a shadow meaning, then I need to go to the main overall object. That's where I always start. The tarot interpretations property, right? In that's an array. I know that if I want the first card, the fool, I'm going to go to the element at index 0. So tarot interpretations 0. Then I need to get into the meanings of the card. And then if I want the first shadow meaning, I need to go to the shadow property of the meanings. and then I could get to the first one of those, for example, by going to the 0th element in the array in shadow. This is something that we need to get used to, right? Picking our path through this kind of information. Okay, so that's the gist of how the JSON format works, okay? Now, where do we get JSON data from? Well, we're kind of looking at a really great source of it right here with Darius Kazemi's Corpora project. I'll just go back to the main page here. So github.com/dariusk/corpora. In the data folder, we have tons and tons and tons of JSON files organized by categories. There's just so many things in here. It's amazing. It's very, very fun. So this could be a first place that you think of when you're wanting some JSON data that's easy to get hold of. Yep, and that will contain interesting kinds of things that you might want to play around with. So one way that you can get JSON data is you can find pre-existing JSON files somewhere, and you can download them and include them in your project, right? Another way that you can get JSON data is that you can make it yourself, right? You can create a new file, and you can, let's do this over here. So I could create a new file in Atom, and I could say it's going to have an object in it, and that's going to have a name, and my name is Pippin, and it's going to have an eye color property. Maybe I'll do like Darius, I'll do an underscore, and that's going to be blue, and have a height property, and that's going to be 180 centimeters, not inches. I don't know, that would be pretty tall, I guess. And this is a JSON file, right? And if I save it, I can save it into my assets data folder and save it as, I don't know, pippin.json, just using that JSON extension, right? And if I save that, it gets formatted properly. Atom is recognizing that this is a correctly formatted JSON file. So you can write your own JSON data if you want to. There's another way of getting hold of JSON data, which is by requesting it over the internet, and we will talk about that as well in this discussion. So, especially finding pre-existing JSON information is a super fun way to do projects. So let's look at that as our primary example. So if I wanted to get hold of some JSON data and play with it, how would I go about that? Well, the first thing that I'm going to need is the file itself, right? So I'm going to go back to Darius's website, and I'm going to go back to the tarot. So I'm going to go to divination, and I'm going to go to tarot interpretations. So here's the file here, right? But this is not the actual file. This is a web page that's showing me what's inside the file. If I want to get this file, I need to click on the raw button here in the interface. And if I click on raw, then this takes me to literally just the text content of tarot interpretations. Now, if I want to have this file, I need to save it. So I'm going to go up to here, save page as, just here, or Command S, and I'm going to save it as tarot interpretations. You can see that the browser knows that it's .json. If I'm worried, I could write in .json here, just to make sure it saves it with the correct extension. And I will save that onto my desktop by default. I like to do it that way. So there it is there. Oh, let me delete these files. We don't really need those. So we've got tarot interpretations.json. The next thing that I want to do is I want to copy that into the project that I'm working on. Now, I'm working in a template P5 project that I've just called JSON, and I'm going to copy it into a data folder. If you're copying your JSON into your project folder and you don't have a data folder, I recommend a data folder in your assets is a good place for this. You can also put it in another location if you want to, or give it another name. So I copy tarot interpretations, move it into that data folder so that it's in my project, right? So now I've got my JSON project, and in assets data, I have tarot interpretations. That means that the file is available inside my project at this point. So that's step one. The next step, though, is I need to be able to, let me close some windows here. So there's tarot interpretations there. Now it's inside my project, right? But now over here in my script, I want to be able to load that data and do stuff with it. So how do I do that? The answer to that is that P5 and many other frameworks that you might be working within, we'll see other examples. P5 has a function specifically for loading JSON data, and it is called load JSON. Let's quickly go to the P5 reference over here. So under the P5 reference, you can either go and kind of search for it if you want to. It's under the data section. Or you can do a find on the page for load JSON. But if we go down to data here, oh, I'm mistaken about where it was. So I'm going to do a find because I've forgotten where, where it is. So I'm going to do find load JSON. Oh, it's in IO, which stands for input output. That's fair enough. So here it is here, load JSON, good name. And if I click through, you can see that we use it in the same way that we use other loading functions in P5, which is to say that the easiest way to use it is that we use it in preload. So we can see an example here where we've got load JSON here, and it's loading data from a URL where there is a JSON file. Now, for now, what we want to do is actually load a local JSON file. So we're going to use it in the same way that we might do load image or something similar. So let's go over here. And we know that if we're going to load something, we're going to need to have a variable to store it in. So I'm going to have a variable called taro data. It's going to start off as undefined because it's not loaded yet. And in preload, I'm going to use load JSON. So I'm going to say taro data load JSON, and then I'm going to give it the path to that data, right, which was assets/data/taro interpretations.json. So it works the same way as other loading things, right? Preload will start, it will load the file at this location. Oh, I'm sorry, not dot is assigned. And when load JSON finishes, it will assign the result into the taro data variable, okay? So then when our program starts, taro data, once we get to setup, will contain the taro information from that file. Obviously, if we run it right now, we're not going to see anything happen because we're not doing anything with the data as of yet. So this is the easiest way to use JSON data, is that we load it inside preload. That way it's just ready when our program begins. So let's use some of this taro data. So let's create a canvas. Window width, window height is always a good place to start. And in draw, let's just do something simple for now. We'll set the background to white, and we will pull out the description of the taro, right? So we can open the file as well over here so we can look at what's in it. Again, there's the main object. This is what's going to be loaded into taro data, right? This object. So that means that if there's a description project here in taro interpretations.json, that's going to be a property of taro data when this gets loaded. So that means that taro data should have a description property once it's loaded. So let's just print that out. That's a good place to begin, right? So I'm going to store it in a variable just for simplicity. So let description, this is where I'm going to store it. And that's going to have taro data.description. Now, we don't need quote marks or anything around description. This is just a regular JavaScript object at this point. It's been loaded from the JSON data, which has those requirements in representing it. But once it's inside our program, it's just a JavaScript object with the same properties and values in it that the file had. So taro data.description gives us that description property, the string inside of it, and then we can just display it, right, with standard displaying code. So I'm going to align my text in the center. I'm going to set the fill to black, and then I'm going to display what text is inside description, which is what was in taro data.description, at the center of the canvas, just so that we can see it easily. And then I'll pop. Okay, so let's run that and make sure that that works. Not beautify, start server. There we go. Oh, and I've loaded it in the wrong page. So let me just quickly head back over here, and let's try that again. There we go. So you can see formatting-wise, not great because the string that's inside that description is quite long. But you can also see that indeed, when we pulled out that description property, it contained the data that was in the file. So it's a beautiful moment, really. we had this data inside a file separate from our program. We loaded it into our program, and then we were able to access that data. So that's a really nice thing. So we loaded it here, and then we accessed it here. It is as simple as that. JSON is much more about what you do with it, right, than the complexity of the process, I suppose. So let's do something more complicated. Let's find a more complicated piece of data. So earlier we talked about looking at the fool's first shadow meaning, which is this one here. How do we get to that inside of our program? Again, we need to be able to pick this path, right? So we've got the overall object here. This is what's inside tarot data. Then we've got the tarot interpretations property of tarot data, so we need to get in there. Then we know that there's an array in there, so we should get to the first element in the array, because that's the fool, so that would be element 0. Within that, we are going to need to get into the meanings property, so the meanings property of that array. And then within that, we need to get to the shadow property of the meanings. And then inside that, there's an array, and we want the first element of that array if we want to get to being gullible and naive. So quite a long path, right? So let's do that step by step. So instead of the description now, I'm going to get the first shadow meaning. And that is going to be inside tarot data, because that's where the object is. Then, inside there, we need to access the tarot interpretations property. That's the first place we need to get to in order to find our way to that meaning. So tarot interpretations. Okay, so that's a property. Inside tarot interpretations is an array of objects. So we want the first one because that's the fool. So the first one is in the array. So we need square brackets at position 0. The first card inside tarot interpretations. Okay, so that gives us this object here, right? All of this stuff here. Then we know that if we're wanting to access the first shadow meaning, we need the meanings property of that object. So we say dot meanings to get to there, right? And then inside the meanings property, there's another object, which is this one here. And in there, we can see it's got two properties, light and shadow, and we know we want the shadow property inside there. So we need to write shadow dot shadow. And then, finally, we know that the shadow property has got an array in it, and that the first element is the first shadow meaning. So we want the 0, the one at index 0 of this array. So then we go back here, and again, it's an array index, so we use square brackets and ask for number 0. That's quite a lot going on there, right? That's quite a long path. And then, of course, I want to print out what's in that variable now. So we're asking for tarot data, which is the overall data, the tarot interpretations property, which contains an array of all the cards. The first card in that array is at position 0. We want to access that card's meanings property. We want to access the shadow property of the meanings. And then we want the first meaning in the array of meanings inside this shadow property. A lot going on there. Let's go look at what that looks like. There you go. Being gullible and naive is indeed that first property. So that's a much more complicated path, right? But this is the kind of thing that we just need to get used to it, right? If you take your time and you pick your way piece by piece through a JSON file, you can translate it into these kinds of expressions that get access to that particular part. Okay, so that's just kind of picking your way to a really specific piece of the file. But what if you're wanting instead to do something more kind of data-oriented, right? So we understand the basic idea of how the structure of the file corresponds to the structure of an object that we load into our program. But what if we want to, for example, do the most obvious thing, which is to get a random fortune? If we want to get a fortune, and let's just clear some of these things away, we're not going to need this anymore. First of all, let's say that we are going to have a fortune here. No fortune found yet. So this is where we'll store our fortune. And we will print it out down here in draw. So instead of the first shadow meaning, we're going to print out the fortune. So how are we going to get a fortune, and where should we do it? Well, where should we do it? I think we should do it in setup, because we only want to get the fortune the one time. at the beginning of the program. It can work out the user's fortune, and then it can be printed out in draw. So how do we get a fortune? The first thing we need to do is we need to pick a random card from the tarot deck. This is a very simple version of fortune with just one card. So if we want to get a random card out of the deck, we need to think about the fact that we know that all of the cards are in this tarot interpretations array. So we want a random element from this array, the one at this property here. And we know how to do that in P5. So we can declare a variable for storing the card that we're going to choose, and we can assign it the result of asking for a random element from tarot data, which is the overall object representing the file, dot tarot interpretations, which is the array of tarot cards. So this will go away and pick a random object from that array that represents a tarot card. Then, if we want to get a fortune, we will set our fortune variable, which we declared up the top here. And we're going to set it to another random thing, which is the card, because now we want a random thing from this card. And what do we want to choose randomly from? We want this fortune-telling array. So we know that once we've got a card, it has a fortune-telling property that has all of the fortunes in an array. So we want to get a random element from card.fortune-telling, because that contains an array of fortunes. That will therefore choose a random card, and then from that card, a random fortune. And that's what we can display on our page. A rainy day is coming, it's time to save. Yeah, well, it's snowing where I am right now, but good enough. And every time I reload this, of course, because the program runs again, it loads the file and then it chooses a new random fortune. So if I reload the page, someone is watching and evaluating your work because this video is on YouTube or you're watching it somewhere like that. Makes sense. So this now is a bit more sophisticated, right? We've got JSON data, but we're doing something with it. We're treating it more like data that can drive a program that could do interesting things like tell your fortune. One more thing about load JSON is that there is another way to use it, not in preload. This can be important depending on how you're writing your program. So currently, we are using load JSON immediately in preload and immediately assigning the result into the tarot data variable, right? However, this is not the only way to use load JSON. The reason it's good is because we don't need to worry about how long this file takes to load, right? But as with most loading-oriented methods or functions like load JSON, we can also use load JSON with a callback. So let's do this. Let's, instead of loading it right at the beginning of our program, let's load the tarot interpretations file when we click. So I'm going to add a mouse pressed function here, which we know is called automatically by P5. I'm going to copy this stuff here. I'm going to cut it actually. Actually, I'm just going to get rid of the preload function. We don't need the preload function anymore here. So in mouse pressed, if I want to load that file when they press the mouse, I do the same thing. I say load JSON, but I can't immediately assign it to a variable because it takes time and we're not in preload anymore. So I can't just immediately assign the result of this. Load JSON will go away and load the file, but not instantaneously. I still need to tell it which file to load. So assets, data, tarot interpretations.json. But I also need to tell it a function to call when that data has been successfully loaded. So that's how load JSON works outside of preload, is we tell it to load something and then it will call a function back, a callback as it's called, when the data has successfully loaded. So I'm going to say that I will have a function called tarot loaded, like that. That will be its name. Then I have to obviously define that function, tarot loaded, like this. And the key thing to know about load JSON and the function that it will call is that it will pass the data that it loaded as an argument to that function. So when this function gets called, it's going to have some information passed through to it as a parameter here. And I'll just call it data, right? So when it's loaded, that means that I can successfully assign across the data, right? So I can now say tarot data, which is where I'm kind of storing the data inside my program, is assigned what's inside the regular data, the data argument that was passed through, that is the actual loaded data from the file. And then I can do the thing that I was doing before, right? So I can get the stuff that I was doing in setup, which is choosing a card and finding a fortune, and I can paste that in down here below. So now we've got the sequence that I click the mouse, which calls mouse pressed. That calls load JSON to load this file. That goes away and does its job, but the program keeps running. It doesn't stop or wait. And we know that when load JSON has succeeded, it's going to call this taro loaded function. And it's going to pass through as an argument the data that it loaded. So the taro will be in here in data. Then I can save the data into my nicely named variable taro data. And then I can do the same process as before. Choose a random card from that data and choose a random fortune from that card. Let's make sure that that works. No fortune found yet because I haven't clicked. I click, and it's super fast, right? Computers are very, very fast. Oh, there's a very specific fortune that's so big that I can't read it. But I clicked, it immediately loaded the data, assigned across the data into my variable, chose a random card, and then also chose a random fortune from that card. And that will happen every time I click. Click, 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 click. Every time it's loading the entire file, right? Computers are fast. It's pretty cool. So why might you want to do things this way instead of using preload? Well, the preload version is easier, no question. So I think if you have any uneasiness, I would stick with the preload version. However, it can be advantageous to load files dynamically. For example, you might want to load one file or another depending on what the user has been doing. In that case, you couldn't load it necessarily in preload, or you wouldn't necessarily want to. It might also be the case that if you have a file that's big or you just want to save time when your program is loading, you avoid preload so that there's no delay at the start of your program, and then you can load your data in the background using this kind of structure here. Completely up to you what you want to do. Generally speaking, if I can, I use preload because I just find it more straightforward. But if you need to load data later on in your program, this is the basic structure here, right? You load it, and then you have a function that will be called, you have a function that will be called when it's loaded. And you just need to remember that it's not loaded instantly. Okay, we're learning a lot of stuff. Let's carry on. So only a couple more things that we need to talk about, I think. Yes, let's talk about them. I'm sorry, I was just thinking about whether or not to break the video there. You can take a pause, obviously, whenever you want. I'm aware that this is running a bit long. So one thing that we saw in the documentation, and I'm actually going to undo my code here to get back to the preload version of the taro loading stuff, just because it's a little more straightforward to look at, right? So there it is there. Get rid of this mouse press. So we're back here. One thing that we saw in the actual documentation for JSON, for load JSON here, is that instead of having a file inside their project, they actually loaded a URL. So this is something that's nice to know. So you don't have to have the file on your computer. You can actually load files that are somewhere else on another computer on the internet if you know the URL that takes you to that file. So instead of downloading taro interpretations, as I've done here, and accessing it locally inside my project, if I knew the URL on Darius Kazemi's website for where taro interpretations is, I could actually load the URL instead. And we do know that, right? Let's head back into the taro interpretations file here. So this is the file, but remember when we wanted to get the actual file, we clicked on raw, right? To get just the textual content of the file. And this is the URL up here in the location box that we can use. So you can see it's a slightly different structure. It says raw.github-user-content.com. But if we copy that URL, Command-C or Control-C on Windows, and we paste it in here where we're doing load JSON, paste, there it is there. So now it's a URL, right? It's load JSON and then https / etc. That's now pointing to a location on the internet. But if we go and look at our program now, over here, it still works, right? My health will improve, thank goodness. And if I reload it, prepare for a setback. Still very fast, right? But now this is going away to the internet, to GitHub, asking for that file, getting the file back, and loading it into our taro data variable. So that works too. That's super convenient for one thing. We didn't have to go through the process of downloading the file. The only thing to remember with this process is that you could have some problems if you don't have internet access, right? If you aren't online, or if the GitHub server, for example, goes down, then you're not going to have access to the file. Whereas if you download the file and have it in your project, then it's always going to be there and always accessible. So that's important to remember when you're making a choice there. So you should prepare for a setback, perhaps, is what I'm saying. The tarot knows, it really does. Okay, last thing that I really want to talk about is kind of an extension of that, right? So we've seen that we can load JSON data from a URL from the internet. And one really powerful kind of extension of that idea is that there are services out there on the internet that don't just have a file of JSON that you can access, but instead they have a program that's listening to a URL that will send dynamic JSON data back to you at the moment that you ask for it. So it will kind of generate some JSON data and send that to you rather than just having a file that is always exactly the same. And that is really interesting. And we would call these an API. So an API that gives back JSON to us. And a really nice example of that is the official joke API. It's nice and easy to use, which I think is very pleasant. Let's go to the official joke API over here. So it's a GitHub repository, as you can see, called official joke API. This is the documentation for the official joke API. And you can see that the way that it works is that it's got URLs, just like we were seeing with the JSON file, but they don't point to JSON files, right? They're pointing to little websites. And the thing about these websites, if we copy one of these URLs and paste it in here, this is the random joke URL, is that they still return JSON data, right? So we can see again, it's a little less clear because it's not formatted for us, but you can see that this has returned a JSON object. And that JSON object contains a joke. It's got 4 properties here. It's got an ID, which is 54 if we care. It's got a type, it's a general joke. And then it's got a setup and a punchline property. And this is the construction of the joke, right? The setup, I had a dream that I was a muffler last night. Punchline, I woke up exhausted. Hilarious. It's a joke. So the neat thing here is that this URL is not a file, right? If I go to it again, it gives me back a different joke. So it's sending a random joke to me when I request that URL. And it's sending the joke to me as JSON data. That's the beauty of this. And there are many, many APIs like this, but let's make this one work, right? So if, for example, I wanted a random programming joke, which I do, I could load this URL with load JSON, and it would send me back a joke in that format that we just saw. So if I paste it in up here, you can see it's going to send me a joke in the same format. One really important thing to notice, though, is it's sending it back to me as an array, right? The first thing that we see here is a square bracket, not a curly bracket. So this is an array. This array contains a single object, and that object represents a joke. And I need to remember that when I'm dealing with the data that comes from this URL so that I can access it correctly, right? So let's go and do that in our program. I'm just going to delete all of this stuff, am I? Yes. I'm just going to paste in this program, actually, so that we can take a look at it together rather than worrying about me typing it in front of you. So use strict always should be there. And here's a program that's going to use that URL that we were just looking at, right? So the things that we're going to need are, because we're going to display this joke, we're going to have a string, which is going to start out as empty. That's going to be the joke that we display on the screen. And we're going to need a variable to store the data that comes back when we load the JSON. It's going to start off as undefined. Then, just like we've been doing, we're going to load that data with load JSON, but we're going to point it to the URL of the joke API, right? So not to a file, but to another program that's going to return JSON data to us. This is the random programming joke, right? So we need to remember, as we saw, that it's going to return an array to us. That's super important to remember. Once preload is finished, we're going to have that joke data inside our joke data variable, and then we can just get the joke. So in setup, again, because we want to do it just once at the beginning of our program, we can get the thing that's at position 0 of the joke data. Now we know that it's just an array with exactly one joke inside it, so that joke is at position 0. So the joke object is joke data position 0. Then we can use the information inside that joke object to set the joke text itself. And we can set the joke text so that it says joke.setup. So we're using a template string here, right? So the backtick characters. So this allows me to include the thing written in the joke's setup, which is the first string representing the setup of the joke. \n gives me 2 carriage returns so that I can separate these 2 things out. And then I'm going to include the punchline. So I'm just going to say setup and then punchline to get my joke text. And then in draw, I'm setting up some text formatting and I'm displaying the joke text here with a text command. So let's go take a look at that and make sure that it works. Back over here. There you go. Why did the programmer quit his job? Because he didn't get a raise. Ooh, homonym joke, homonym attack. Very good. So you can see what's happened here, right? The program started in preload. It asked for that URL, which dynamically returned some JSON data. We put that into our joke data variable, and then in setup, we pulled out the joke and we put its setup and punchline into our joke text and displayed it. So every time I load this program, that's what happens. What did the router say to the doctor? It hurts when IP. A little bit risque there, but there you go. IP is Internet Protocol. It's a way that we send data over the internet. That is why it is hilarious. Just so you are aware, in the notes, there is some information about how load.json works with array-based JSON. And there's a secret thing which, although we can treat it like it's an array, if we use load.json and preload, it isn't really an array. You can read all of the information about that if you want to know more about it. For now, I'm just going to leave it alone. As you can see, we can treat it like an array by asking for the thing at position 0. So it's fairly useful as it is. So some final thoughts then. We've seen a lot. We've seen finding files with JSON in them, writing files with JSON in them, loading files with JSON in them and accessing the data, loading files from the internet, and also using APIs. There are lots of places to find JSON APIs. If you Google JSON API, maybe you include free if you don't want to pay for it, you will find lots and lots of public APIs that will give you back JSON data of various dynamic kinds. Super exciting. A lot of them do require that you register with the website to get an API key so that you have permission to access that JSON. They will always have instructions for how to use that API key, and it's never terribly complicated. We'll have at least one example of that in the examples, I think. A final word of something that can just happen when you're using these APIs that's worth knowing about is CORS and CORS policy. CORS, C-O-R-S, stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And the key thing to know is that if you see a CORS policy error when you're trying to load data, that is super aggravating. It's so aggravating that I would be tempted to not use the source that you're using to try and get that data if you have a CORS policy error. If you really, really want to use it, I have a potential solution again in the too much information section of the notes for this discussion. I would recommend just moving to another source of data. It's a security issue in browsers to make sure basically that you can't end up with big security problems in the transmission of data between computers, right? If you can, try and find APIs that say that they have open CORS. If CORS is open, it means that you won't get that error when you try to use it. There are other fixes, so feel free to investigate further in too much information. That's what I want to say about JSON. It's a wonderful world to explore. Gives us a standard format for creating data files that we can use in our programs rather than having all of the data in the JavaScript itself. And there's lots and lots of data already out there in the world in the JSON format that we can use in our programs to make really interesting and exciting and dynamic and surprising programs. So the key skills that we need to build up with this is that we need to be able to read the JSON format. We need to be able to see JSON and understand how to access the different parts of it. Ideally, therefore, we can also write the JSON format if we want to make our own JSON files. We need to, let me put myself on camera, we need to be able to load JSON data into our program, right? Which we know that we do in P5 with load JSON. And we need to then be able to access the data inside there and do things with it, which we know we do by following those kinds of chains of properties and arrays and so forth to the right place in the data. There's so much to play with. It can lead to really, really interesting projects, I think, and I'm excited for you that you get to play around with data from now on. Okay, that's it from me, and that's your introduction to JSON. See you next time.